4, 3, 2, 1. Earth below us, drifting far.
Hi there, welcome to the Firm Foundation series. My name is Yancy. Today it's lesson 31, David the Shepherd King. Well, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. And so begins Charles Dickens' The Tale of Two Cities. And really that's the way I felt as a young man when I, along with several of my friends, we left Manhattan Beach, California, and we moved to the state of Vermont, to Burlington, Vermont, to start a Christian commune so we could preach the gospel. And we didn't have much money, and we had some really lean times along the way when we were thankful for something as simple as a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. But I made a lot of good friends. We saw God's provision time and time again, saw God do some amazing things, and knew that He was in control. We were naive, and we also did some stupid things, but in the midst of all of it, God knew our hearts, and God was still faithful and took care of us. I remember one time when two of my college roommates were traveling across country, and they stopped off to visit me there in Burlington, Vermont. They stayed a couple days, and then we said goodbye, and they headed off to resume their trip back to California. But about an hour later, there's a knock on the door, and there's my roommate, my former roommate, Gary, standing there, and he says, well, we got so far outside of town, and then the Lord told us to come back, and He told me to give you this, and He hands me a $100 bill. A $100 bill. At that time, that's like $500 today. I mean, that was a lot of money. But God told him to do it, and he was faithful to what God said, and that was really needed at that moment. We really needed that money. That was a blessing. So we just saw God's provision for us, taking care of us every step of the way, and using friends like Gary and Rob and others, as well as the jobs that the Lord gave us to provide so that we could continue to preach the gospel there to the state of Vermont. And I think that David would say the same thing about his early years before he came to power as the king of Israel. I mean, he had some difficult times. I mean, he was the youngest son. Like I said last time, he was considered to be the runt of the litter. He got all the dirty work, all the dirty jobs no one else wanted to do. It fell upon him. And his brothers, they didn't look up to him. They treated him with disdain, with disrespect and disgust. He wasn't even present for his selection as the king of Israel. And after he was anointed as Israel's next king and he defeated the giant Goliath, he had to flee from King Saul, who sought to perpetuate his reign by killing his replacement, which was namely David. Well, these were difficult days for David, but they were also the best of times. I mean, David learned to deal with danger. He also learned how to fight, and he came to rely upon God and to love God's word. He learned obedience. He learned submission, even when his life was in danger. He developed close, enduring friendships and alliances. I also want to take time to let you know that some of the material for today's lesson comes from the Bible for Dummies by Jeffrey Gagan, professor of biblical theology at Boston College, as well as Dr. Michael Holman, professor of biblical studies at Xavier University of Louisiana, and it's published by Wiley Publishing Incorporated. And their book, The Bible for Dummies, is an excellent resource to give you a better understanding of the Bible. I mean, they explain things in everyday plain English, along with some great illustrations, and of course, they throw in a dose of humor and wit. So if you want to get a better overall understanding of the Bible as we go through this Firm Foundation series, go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or Google's Play Store and get this excellent resource, The Bible for Dummies. Also, I want to remind you that you can go to our website. The address is right here on the screen, foundationstudy.weebly.com, and there you can download notes for today's lesson so you can follow along with everything that I'm talking about. Also, we have notes for previous lessons as well as all the videos of all the lessons up to this point. So check out our website, foundationstudy.weebly.com. And now let's review last week's lesson, The Rise of David the Shepherd Boy, just to see what you remember. Okay? Question number 1. Samuel goes to Jesse's house in Bethlehem to look for the next king. What is the message that God gives to Samuel as he's looking at Jesse's sons? God says, but the Lord said to Samuel, don't judge by his appearance or height, for I have rejected him. The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Question 2. How was David armed when he faced Goliath? He only had a shepherd's staff and a slingshot and 5 smooth stones. 3. And whose name did David say had authorized him to fight Goliath and win? He said, I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. And 4. After David kills Goliath, what event causes King Saul to become jealous of David? while the Israelite women go around the streets singing, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. 5. When David comes upon Saul in the cave, what does he do? Well, he cuts off the edge of Saul's robe while he's asleep. And 6. Why doesn't David follow the advice of his men and kill King Saul, who's asleep in the cave? It's because David knows that King Saul is still God's anointed king and refuses to touch God's anointed. 7. How does Nabal treat David and his men after they've offered protection for him, his household, and his sheep? He treats David and his men with contempt, mocking David and his men as outlaws. 8. Who intervenes on Nabal's behalf? His wife Abigail, who intercedes on behalf of her husband, whom she says is a fool. And 9. What happens to Nabal? He suffers a stroke, he's paralyzed, he dies 10 days later. 10. And what becomes of Nabal's wife Abigail? She marries David. 11. Samuel is the last what of Israel? Judge. 12. When Samuel dies, how does Saul try to communicate with him? By consulting the witch at Endor. And finally, 13. What message does Samuel give to Saul from beyond the grave? It says, the next day Saul and his sons will be killed by the Philistines. Well, today we're going to learn about David as the king of Israel. And here's an amazing thing. It was prophesied by the prophet Micah that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Even when the wise men visited Herod, they referenced this prophecy. Let's look at Matthew 2, verse 1. And now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. So the wise men were looking for the deliverer, the Messiah, the one who would be the king of the Jews as well as shepherd of the people of Israel. And Matthew 1:1 says, Jesus, the Messiah, is referred to as the son of David. 17 times in the New Testament he's called the son of David. But the question arises, how could Jesus be the son of David if David lived approximately 1,000 years before Jesus was even born? And the answer is that Yeshua, Jesus, the Messiah, he was the fulfillment of the prophecy of the seed of David. See, Jesus is the promised Messiah, which means that he had to come from the lineage of David. And we'll examine this further in future lessons. But for now, I want you to see that even as David was a shepherd and a king, so also the Messiah would be a king from King David's family line and would also be a shepherd and a king, which is why he's called the son of David. Now let's look at the chronological timeline, and you're going to notice that there are 3 major kings, starting with King Saul, and then King David, and finally David's son Solomon. And I placed a red arrow pointing to David, and notice the approximate time when all this is going on. It's about 1000 BC. That's a little over 3,000 years ago. Now we come to B. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Well, David finds out about Saul and Jonathan's death, and he makes this famous lament. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. And of Jonathan in particular, David says, I grieve for you, my brother Jonathan. You were precious to me. Your love was exceedingly wonderful to me, surpassing the love of women, and so close was their bond of friendship. But now things get pretty messy as David sets out to secure his throne. We come to C. David secures his throne. And the theme here is that man must have faith in order to please God and be saved. Well, now that Saul is dead, one would think that David would quickly, almost automatically, become Israel's king. But this is not the case at all. In fact, it's going to be more than 7 years after Saul's death before David becomes the king of Israel, of all Israel. David sought God's guidance and he returned to Hebron, where he was anointed king over Judah. And David's first kingly act was to reward the people of Jabesh Gilead for courageously removing Saul's body from public display and giving him a proper burial. And after Saul is dead, David does not immediately become king over Israel because the northern tribes make Saul's son, Ishbaal, sometimes known as Ishbosheth, their king. Eventually, though, Ishbaal's general, Abner, realizes that David is the better man, and he offers to bring Ishbaal's forces to David. And David's general Joab, however, feels Abner is too dangerous to be trusted, and he kills him in an act of treachery. Well, not long after this, Ishmael also meets his end when two soldiers sneak into his room while he's asleep, and they cut off his head. As in the case of Saul's death, when the men report to David what they've done, rather than reward them, David has them killed for their treachery. Yet because of their treachery, David is now the undisputed king of Israel. We come to D, David's political savvy. David's first strategic move as king of both Judah and the northern tribes of Israel is to move his capital from Hebron, which is in Judah, to Jerusalem, a city previously not belonging to either Judah or the northern tribes, and which was on the border between both the north and the south. And thus David's choice of Jerusalem as capital is somewhat analogous to the choice of Washington, D.C. as the capital of the United States. In both cases, the capital is on the border of both the north and the south, and did not belong to any one tribe or state. David also solves a religious dilemma. Two groups of priests wanted the esteemed position of Israel's high priest. One group, whose leader was Abiathar, seems to have traced its lineage back to Moses. The other group, whose leader was Zadok, traced its lineage back to Aaron. So David solves this problem by appointing both priests as the high priest. David's culminating strategic move is to transfer the sacred Ark of the Covenant and tabernacle from Kiriath Jearim to Jerusalem. However, this is tricky, and David runs into some problems. We come to E, transferring the Ark. The theme here is man can come to God only according to God's will and plan. Read with me 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 1. So David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000, and David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baal, Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned on the cherubim. And they carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went before the ark. And David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. And when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down there because of his error, and he died there beside the ark of God. And David was angry because the Lord had broken out in anger against Uzzah, and that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. And David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" So David was not willing to take the ark of the Lord into the city of David, but David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all of his household. So here's what's going on. The procession accompanying the transfer of the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem is filled with music, shouting, horns, song, and dance. Just an incredible celebration is going on. But tragedy suddenly strikes when the ark begins to totter and it looks like it might fall. And so the man who's right next to it, Uzzah, he reaches out his hand to steady it. And because of his concern, he's struck dead by God. And this puzzling event enrages and angers David. But the message is clear. You don't mess with the ark because it's holy. You don't even touch the Ark of the Covenant because it's holy. The other important thing to note is that David was not transporting the ark in the prescribed manner. So really, Uzzah's death really falls upon David. David's responsible for Uzzah's death because David was not transporting the ark the way God had instructed. What was the right way? Well, the Levites were the ones who were supposed to carry the ark, and the poles were to be put through the little ringlets at the bottom of the ark. The poles were to be placed on the shoulders of specifically chosen men, and they were to balance it as they carried it from one place to another. And David didn't bother to do that. He took a convenient route, and he changed the details to fit the expediency of the hour. Now notice the difference depicted in these pictures. David was moving the ark on a cart, which became unsteady, and Uzzah reached out to steady it, and he was struck dead by God. Whereas the prescribed method which God gave them to transport the ark was to use 2 poles, which meant that the ark would not become unsteady because it was being carried by 4 men. Well, when David witnesses the death of Uzziah for trying to save the ark from falling over, he gets mad at God. He says he's not going to bring the ark into Jerusalem. So instead, he drops the ark off at the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And we're told that the Ark of the Covenant remained there in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months. And while it was there, the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and his entire household exceedingly. So finally, David wises up. He realizes that the fault was his because he's not following God's instructions for the proper transport of the Ark of the Covenant. So 3 months later, he continues this parade with the Ark, and he dances before the Ark with all of his might. And when the parade finally enters into Jerusalem, the Ark is taken into the tabernacle, and a great feast is held. Well, that evening when David returns home, Michal, David's wife, she's not in a parting mood. She says, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today before the eyes of his virgin maids as a vulgar man whom shamelessly would uncover himself." So apparently David is dancing, and he's only got a nightshirt that revealed more than Michal wanted him to reveal. And David, who feels innocent in the matter, he rebukes Michal for her questioning of his character. And the story concludes, "And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child until the day of her death." That is to say, because she is so concerned about David exposing himself that he will never again expose himself in her presence. Consequently, she died childless. Now we come to F, building houses for God and David. The theme here is God communicates with man. The theme is God is faithful. He never changes. He always keeps his promises. Well, David now resides in this beautiful palace. He decides that he wants to upgrade God's house from a mobile home, the tabernacle, to a state-of-the-art temple. But as it turns out, though, God prefers the tabernacle. And furthermore, as far as God's concerned, David's hands are too bloody from all of his wars to build such a sacred, holy building. However, God appreciates David's intentions. And in a play on words, God tells David that although he's not going to build God a house, God will build him a house in the form of a dynasty. God even promised David that his dynasty will endure forever, a promise referred to as the Davidic covenant. So in other words, God is foretelling David of the coming deliverer, the Messiah, who will come from David's own family line and will become the shepherd king of Israel for all eternity. I want you to note that God's promise to David that his dynasty would last forever, it's cut short in 586 BC when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem. As a result, later prophets understood God's promise to mean that he would again raise up a descendant of David to rule over Israel. Only this new king would usher in a kingdom, as God promised, that would never end, an everlasting, eternal kingdom. And this belief became known as the Messianic expectation. And it means looking forward to the coming of the anointed one, the Messiah. And now we come to G, David and Bathsheba. Theme here is God is everywhere all the time, and he knows everything. Well, the story of David and Bathsheba begins with a notice intended to prepare the reader for trouble. It was spring, the time when kings go out to war. And David, however, he stays home, sending his general Joab in his place. Spring is also the time when birds and bees are in full swing, and trouble is on the horizon. It's the kind of trouble that arises from greed, lust, and arrogance. Well, late one afternoon, David takes a stroll on the palace roof, and he spies this beautiful woman bathing. And this is not an ordinary bath, but it's a ritual bath that a woman takes after menstruation. And this is vital information in the story because she clearly is not pregnant at this point. And David asks his assistant who this woman is. And he's informed that her name is Bathsheba. She is the wife of a man named Uriah, one of David's trusted soldiers who's now out in the field. Well, David summons Bathsheba to his chamber. And one thing leads to another, and he breaks 2 of God's 10 commandments. David covets his neighbor's wife, and he commits adultery. David soon adds a 3rd violation to the list. Well, shortly thereafter, Bathsheba sends a message to David, and she tells him, "I am with child. I'm with your child." David quickly devises a plan, and truth be told, it's really a clever plan. David summons Uriah home from the battlefield. And after asking him about the war, David instructs Uriah to go home and wash your feet, which is a euphemism for having sexual intercourse. But instead, Uriah sleeps at the door of the palace and he does not go home. And when questioned about this the next day, Uriah tells David that he won't go home and enjoy himself while Israel and the ark remain on the battlefield. So finally, we meet a righteous man here in the Bible, and he's ruining everything for David. Actually, Uriah's statement is an unintended rebuke because David is at home and he's not fighting. He should be out on the battlefield along with his men. Moreover, he's not just enjoying himself while others are fighting for his kingdom, but he's enjoying himself with the wife of one of those who's fighting for his kingdom. But rather than give up on his plan, David gets Uriah drunk, thinking that the alcohol will loosen him up just a little bit, and it'll result in Uriah going home to sleep with his wife. But still, Uriah will not go home. Now this story is filled with irony because Uriah, a Hittite who's a non-Israelite, he's not an Israelite, basically Uriah knows God's rules better than David. Soldiers fighting for God need to be ritually pure, and that means that they can have no sexual relations. Because Uriah won't go along with David's plan, David writes a letter instructing Joab to place Uriah on the front lines and then have all the other troops withdraw, exposing Uriah to the enemy. Basically, they're going to leave him naked out there on the front line without anyone else around him. And when Uriah arrives back at the front, he gives Joab the letter, who does exactly as he's been instructed by King David. When Bathsheba finds out that her husband is dead, she mourns for the requisite time and then marries David. Their child, a son, is eventually born, and David, it seems, has gotten away with murder and adultery. But not so fast. David's trusted prophet confronts David. H. Nathan confronts David. You the man. The theme here is that God is everywhere all the time. He knows everything. The theme is God is holy and righteous and demands death as a payment for sin. Well, God's trusted prophet Nathan comes to David and informs him of a tremendous injustice that's taken place in his kingdom. Let's read 2 Samuel 12, verse 1. And the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said to him, There were 2 men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb which he had bought. And he brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. And now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the guest who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. And he shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity. And Nathan said to David, You're the man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel. I delivered you out of the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And as if this were too little, I would have added to you much more. Why have you so despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with a sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, have killed him with the sword of the Amorites. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you despised me, have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, Behold, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house. I will take your wives before your eyes, and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of the sun. And David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, The Lord also has put away your sin, and you shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child who is born to you shall die. Then Nathan went to his house, and the Lord afflicted the child that Uriah's wife bore to David, and he became sick. So Nathan looks David straight in the eye, and he says, You're the man. And David unknowingly is condemned, because he's the parable's rich man who had many wives, but he took Uriah's only wife. So David stands in shock as Nathan continues to deliver God's message. David's dynasty will continue, but he will receive a threefold punishment. First, the sword will never leave David's house, meaning that David's family will be undone by violence. 2, someone will take David's wives and sleep with them in public, because David took his neighbor's wife in secret. And finally, 3, the child of David and Bathsheba from their adulterous affair will die. Well, the third punishment comes true first. The child that they had through their adulterous affair dies, but David and Bathsheba have another son named Solomon. And the next 2 punishments come to fruition shortly afterwards as David's family gradually begins to fall apart. I, fighting for David's throne. Well, similar to making sausage, the politics of an ancient monarchy are more appealing when you're unaware of what's on the inside. The Bible gives us a rare glimpse into the inner workings of a royal family, and it's not very pretty. We come to J, the rape of Tamar. David's oldest son, Amnon, is the crown prince, but he'll not live long enough to reach the throne. His trouble begins with his infatuation for his beautiful half-sister Tamar, which makes him sick with love. Amnon's cousin Jonadab, who's described as being very wise, he gives some very unwise advice. He instructs Amnon to feign illness, and then asks his father to allow Tamar to nurse him back to health. Well, when they're alone together, Jonadab schemes that Amnon is to sleep with her, or as you might say, rape her. Amnon foolishly does as Jonadab instructs. However, when David learns of Amnon's actions, he does nothing. He leaves the punishment to another, namely Tamar's full brother, Absalom. Well, 2 years later, Absalom decides to throw a party. But this is no ordinary celebration, but rather it's a sheep shearing festival. Now think about this for a minute. There's abundant alcohol, there's hundreds of rowdy young men with shears and thousands of sheep, and these parties were so out of control that they made a fraternity party seem pretty meek and mild. And Amnon gets drunk, but he's not just ordinary drunk, he's sheep shearing festival drunk. And then, according to the plan, Absalom's men, they jump Amnon and they kill him. And fearing reprisal from his father, Absalom flees Israel. However, eventually David and Absalom are reconciled, and Absalom returns to Jerusalem. And now we come to K, rebellious children and parents in denial. The theme here is that God is faithful, He never changes, He always keeps His promises. The theme here is that God is holy and righteous, He demands death as a payment for sin. Well, Absalom doesn't waste any time there in Jerusalem waiting for David to die so that he can become king. He rises early every morning and he stands at the city gate, the center of action for a biblical city. And when people pass by on their way for judgment from King David, Absalom promises them that if he were king, they would receive a more favorable decision. Well, eventually Absalom steals the hearts of the Israelites from David with these tactics, along with his good looks. In fact, along with Samson, Absalom has some pretty famous biblical hair. His hair is described as both beautiful and abundant. So much so that when they cut it annually, it weighs about 5 pounds. And just as hair proved to be vital in the downfall of Samson, Absalom's beautiful locks of hair proved to be his undoing. Well, after winning the hearts of the majority of Israel, Absalom declares himself to be the king, and David is forced to flee Jerusalem. As one of his first acts of state, Absalom sets up a tent on the palace roof in Jerusalem, the same spot from which David first saw Bathsheba. And then he proceeds to sleep with many of David's wives in broad daylight. This action fulfills Nathan's prophecy that because David took another man's wife in secret, someone would take his wives in public. And that someone is David's own son, Absalom. Well, eventually, though, David's forces defeat Absalom's, and Absalom is forced to flee from battle. However, while Absalom is escaping by mule, his long hair gets tangled up in a tree. He's left hanging there. And when Joab finds Absalom, he orders him killed, even though David gave strict orders that no harm should come to his son. And when David hears of Absalom's death, he's very upset. And he famously mourns, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son, would I have died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." And now we come to L, David's last days. Well, near the end of 2 Samuel, we're treated to a beautiful song composed by David, a song that echoes many of the psalms that are ascribed to King David. We read in 2 Samuel 22, verse 1, "And David spoke to the Lord the words of this song on the day when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies, from the hand of Saul. He said, 'The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold, my refuge, my Savior, and you saved me from violence. I call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised, and I am saved from my enemies. For the waves of death encompassed me, the torrents of destruction assailed me, the cords of Sheol entangled me. The snares of death confronted me. In my distress I called upon the Lord. To my God I called. From his temple he heard my voice, and my cry came to his ears. Then the earth reeled and rocked. The foundations of the heavens trembled and quaked because he is angry. Smoke went up from his nostrils, and devouring fire from his mouth. Glowing coals flamed forth from him. He bowed the heavens and came down. Thick darkness was under his feet. He rode a cherub and flew. He was seen on the wings of the wind. He made darkness around him his canopy. Thick clouds, a gathering of water. Out of the brightness before him coals of fire flamed forth. The Lord thundered from heaven, and the Most High uttered his voice. He sent out arrows and scattered them, lightning and routed them. Then the channels of the sea were seen. The foundations of the world were laid bare at the rebuke of the Lord, at the blast of the breath of his nostrils. He sent from them on high. He took me. He drew me out of many waters. He rescued me from my strong enemy, from those who hated me, for they were too mighty for me. They confronted me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my support. He brought me out into a broad place. He rescued me, because he delighted in me. The Lord dealt with me according to my righteousness. According to the cleanness of my hands he rewarded me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord, and I have not wickedly departed from my God. For all his rules were before me, and from his statutes I did not turn aside. I was blameless before him, and I kept myself from guilt. And the Lord has rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to my cleanness in his sight. With the merciful you show yourself merciful, and with the blameless man you show yourself blameless. With the purified you deal purely, and with the crooked you make yourself seem tortuous. You save a humble people, but your eyes are on the haughty to bring them down. For you are my lamp, O Lord, and my God lightens my darkness. By you I can run against a troop, and by my God I can leap over a wall. This God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord proves true. He's a shield for all those who take refuge in him. For who is God but the Lord? And who is a rock except our God? This God is my strong refuge and has made my way blameless. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He sets me secure on the heights. He trains my hands for war so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. You have given me the shield of your salvation, and your gentleness made me great. You gave me a wide place for my steps under me, and my feet did not slip. I pursued my enemies, I destroyed them, and did not turn back until they were consumed. I consumed them, I thrust them through, so they did not rise. They fell under my feet. For you equipped me with strength for the battle, and you made those who rise against me sink under me. You made my enemies turn their backs to me, and those who hated me, I destroyed them. They looked, but there was none to save. They cried to the Lord, but he did not answer them. I beat them fine as the dust of the earth. I crushed them and stamped them down like the mire of the streets. You delivered me from the strife of my people. You kept me as the head of the nations. People whom I had not known served me. Foreigners came cringing to me. As soon as they heard of me, they obeyed me. Foreigners lost heart and came trembling out of their fortresses. The Lord lives, and blessed be my rock, and exalted be my God, the rock of my salvation, the God who gave me vengeance and brought down peoples under me, who brought me out from my enemies. You exalted me above those who rose against me. You delivered me from men of violence. For this I will praise you, O Lord, among the nations, and sing praises to your name. Great salvation he brings to his king, and shows steadfast love to his anointed, to David and his offspring forever. And then we hear David's parting words as he reflects upon his life and reign. 2 Samuel chapter 23, verse 1. Now these are the last words of David, the oracle of David the son of Jesse, the oracle of the man who was raised on high, the anointed of the God of Jacob, the sweet psalmist of Israel. The Spirit of the Lord speaks to me. His word is on my tongue. The God of Israel has spoken. The rock of Israel has said to me, when one rules justly over men, ruling in the fear of God, he dawns on them like the morning light, like the sun shining forth on a cloudless morning, like rain that makes grass to sprout from the earth. For does not my house stand so with God? For he has made me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and secure. For will he not cause to prosper all my help and my desire? But worthless men are like thorns that are thrown away, for they cannot be taken with a hand. But the man who touches them arms himself with iron and the shafts of a spear, and they are utterly consumed with fire. So this is a fitting end to the story of David, only it's not the end. As 2 Samuel draws to a close, David makes a very bad decision. He takes a census of Israel. And why is this a bad decision? Well, David's census is for the purpose of determining the number of able-bodied soldiers in Israel, which really reflects a lack of trust in God as Israel's ultimate protector. Even Joab, the commander of David's army, warns David not to take a census. But David insists. In response, God sends a deadly plague against Israel, thereby weakening the very thing that David is trusting in, basically his population, all of his men. So to end the plague, David purchases a plot of land that has a threshing floor. He offers a sacrifice. Because threshing floors symbolize bountiful crops, they are commonly converted into holy ground. So David's choice of this location is not entirely random. After the sacrifice is made, the plague comes to an end. Beyond providing a lesson about trusting God's protection and provision, this story explains how the future site of the temple was purchased, a temple that David's son and successor Solomon would soon build. Let's review today's lesson, see if you understood everything that we've been talking about. Question number 1. Where did the prophet Micah say the Messiah would be born? Bethlehem. 2. Where was David from? Bethlehem. 3. What are 2 characteristics that David and the coming Messiah deliverer would both have in common? They would be rulers as well as shepherds. And 4. Why is the title Son of David a reference to the coming Messiah deliverer? Because it means that the Messiah will come from David's family lineage as well as being a shepherd and a ruler. And 5. When David makes the famous statement in 2 Samuel 1:25, "Oh, how the mighty have fallen," who is he referring to? He's referring to King Saul and his son Jonathan. And 6. Once David becomes king, where does he move the capital? He moves it from Hebron to Jerusalem. 7. David runs into a problem while transporting the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle from Kiriath Jearim to Jerusalem. What happens? Well, the Ark is being transported on a cart, begins to totter, and Uzziah reaches out and takes hold of the Ark to steady it, and he's immediately struck dead. 8. Why did God allow this to happen? Because David was not transporting the Ark of the Covenant in the prescribed manner. 9. How is the Ark of the Covenant to be transported? With the use of 2 poles carried by 4 men. And 10. When David wants to build a house for God, what does God say? God tells him no thanks because his hands are so bloody from all the wars that he's fought. However, God tells David that he will have a house that will last forever. It'll be a dynasty that will endure forever. 11. And what is this promise that God makes to David called? It's called the Davidic covenant. And 12. It was spring when kings go out to war. Where was King David? He was on his palace roof watching Bathsheba take a purification bath. And 13. Once David discovers that Bathsheba is pregnant, what does he do about her husband Uriah? He immediately summons Uriah to come home from battle so that he can be with his wife. And 14. Does Uriah go home to his wife? No. He sleeps at the door of the palace. And 15. What final step does David take to get rid of Uriah? He instructs his commander Joab to place Uriah on the front lines of battle, and then have all the troops of Israel withdraw, exposing Uriah to the enemy. And 16. How does God confront David regarding his affair with Bathsheba? David receives a visit from the prophet Nathan, who tells David a parable about a rich man with many herds who stole a poor man's only lamb. At the end of the story, he looks David straight in the eye and says, "You're the man." And 17. Which one of David's sons tries to steal the throne from his father? Absalom. 18. What was Absalom's distinguishing feature? His hair, which ended up causing his death. Well, our next lesson, 32, we're going to look at the golden age of Solomon. Well, that's it for today. I hope that you learned a lot, and we covered a lot. This is really important, talking about King David's reign. The Bible says that David was a man after God's own heart. We can learn so much about even how to pray by reading the Psalms and all the titles that David would give to God as his rock, his shield, his fortress, his firm foundation. He gave God so many great titles. He was so close to God. He spent so much time worshiping, praising God. So read a psalm or 2 or 3 this week and just turn that psalm around. Let that psalm be your prayer back to God, a prayer or praise to God as you're reading the psalm. Well, I'll join you again next week. Until then, this is Pastor Dale saying, may the shalom blessings of God be upon you and your family. Bye.